Welcome to Mansplaining, a podcast about the interesting things you can discover if you just take the time to learn. My name is Joe. I'm your host for this week, and as always, I'm joined by my college friend Mark. Together, we'll explore what's on our minds and hopefully figure out a thing or two about a thing or two. Hey, Mark.
Hey, Joe. How's it going?
All right.
Yeah, that's all you got for me is all right.
I thought you would have something for me.
Well, yeah, I do. It's been a hell of a week. Had a death in the family this week, and let me tell you, deaths during COVID bites because you can't get together with the people who you care about, and you can't give people a hug because they're feeling sad, and so many people have died. Like, we're pushing 400,000 people who've died from the disease, and that's not counting the people who just happened to die during the disease. And we've all been shut out from the things that we expected to be able to go through at times like this. So life can be hard.
Yeah, I'm sorry to hear that. It's just terrible. There's nothing really to say about it except it's awful, and hopefully we'll be out of it sooner rather than later.
Yeah. Knock on wood. So let's think about some happier things.
Yeah, well, I'm not sure whether this topic is exactly a happier thing, but it is certainly something that's been on my mind for a while. I noticed late last year that the Trump administration had initiated a couple of antitrust lawsuits against Facebook and Google. And combined with the very loud calls from both left and right about how unfair the social media platforms are and how everybody's getting screwed basically by them, it occurred to me that this is one of the few issues in American life right now where the left and right seem to agree on something profound, although I suspect it's for very different reasons. So for that reason, I asked you to look into this subject, and basically the question was, should we break up big tech? And what is it about these antitrust laws that are intriguing? It seems like antitrust law has not been a focus of federal efforts for a long time. So what's going on exactly?
Okay, well, when we say big tech, we're really talking about four companies, and that would be Facebook, Google, Amazon, and Apple. And right away, your question becomes tricky because those four companies have very different businesses. Just looking at it quickly, Facebook, of course, is the dominant social network. It has 225 million users in the U.S. alone. And Facebook makes money by collecting information on its users and leveraging that information to serve up targeted advertising. Google, or rather its parent company, Alphabet, has many businesses, but the only one that makes any money is the one that it started with, search. Like Facebook, Google makes money by serving up targeted ads based on what it knows about you from the ways that you use its products. Amazon is, of course, the dominant online retailer. It started as an online bookstore, but eventually expanded into the so-called everything store. It makes money by selling things to you and providing a marketplace by which other companies are able to sell things to you. And then behind-the-scenes technologies like Amazon Web Services. And then there's Apple, which makes the phone you might be listening to this podcast on, and it makes the computer I'm using to record this audio on, and it's got a music business and a TV streaming channel, and they sell more watches than any other company in the world, and they make digital accessories and on and on and on. But basically, Apple is as much a lifestyle brand like Nike as it is the maker of products.
So Twitter doesn't make the big four, I guess, huh?
Twitter does not make the big four. There was one point in the history of social media when it seemed like Twitter was the way to go, but they kind of shuffled their feet and lost their way for a little while. So Twitter is a marginally profitable business, but they're no way as dominant as Facebook. So we have four companies and four very different business models. For Amazon and Apple, you are the customer. In the case of Facebook and Google, you are the product, and advertisers are the customer. So any answer to the question, should we break up big tech, would need to consider the specifics of how those four companies operate. First, though, let's take a step back and look at the reasons why people have offered for why big tech should be broken up. And broadly speaking, just at a high level, it's that Google search and Facebook have destroyed the news industry, and a free press is indispensable to democracy. Social media in general, and Facebook in particular, have become a threat to democracy. Facebook, for instance, has enormous power of what information is presented to its users, which gives Mark Zuckerberg, just one person, enormous influence over who, for instance, gets elected as president. Social networks have shown no ability or interest in policing disinformation or violent rhetoric on their platforms. And in this case, Twitter is just as guilty as Facebook. YouTube would be included in that. And network effects make it very difficult for competition to arise naturally. Which is to say that once you become a Facebook with so many users, all of your friends and family are already on there. So it's very easy to join Facebook and immediately be integrated into your social connections. But a startup social network that's just has a strong idea and, a plucky dream, you not only move over there, you have to convince everyone who you're connected with to move over there. Otherwise, it's just of no use to you. So network effects make it very difficult for a new social network to gain traction. So a third reason that people have offered is that companies like Facebook and Google play fast and loose with user privacy. Google, in fact, at one point in its history, their chief executive officer announced that privacy is over and people should get over it. And all of these companies, people say, are too big and stifle innovation. So broadly speaking, those are the reasons that are offered. Proponents of these views would like the government to break up these companies, and so we should take a quick look at antitrust law to see what is actually illegal under current law. So, question for you, Joe. When we are talking about legislation designed to go against monopolistic business practices, why do we call it antitrust instead of anti-monopoly?
I don't know.
Okay.
I think there was such a thing as a trust. That's probably different from a monopoly, but this history is 100 years old and I don't know it, which is one of the reasons why I was asking you about it.
Yeah, well, you're right. The answer to that question goes back to the 19th century. So broadly speaking, a trust is an arrangement where one person holds ownership of property but cannot use it for themselves. Instead, they hold it in trust for the benefit of someone else. So you can still see that sort of arrangement within terms like, a trust fund kid or trustees, or I hold this in trust. And its greatest history is connected with sort of a private arrangement where, say, a child who's not ready to inherit property, that property would be put in trust with a friend or a relative who would manage it on behalf of the child.
Okay.
In the 19th century, though, businesses started using trust arrangements as a way to combine several large businesses into one very large business. Under the trust agreement, individual shareholders in the subsidiary companies agreed to convey their shares to the trust, and a board of trustees would manage the trust with executives of the parent company exerting control by way of the trust certificates that they held. So that's a business trust.
Okay.
There were a large number of business trusts by the 1880s, but Standard Oil is probably the most famous example. Led by John D. Rockefeller, Standard Oil had bought up virtually all of the oil refineries in the U.S., then used this position to expand into oil exploration, distribution, and retail distribution. This sort of business model is called vertical integration, and it's something that Apple is quite famous for today, and we'll have a lot more to say about Apple later on. But by 1904, Standard Oil controlled 91% of oil production in the U.S. and 85% of sales, and its internal operations were controlled by way of a trust. So this arrangement worked so well that many businesses copied the arrangement. And in the late 19th century, there were railroad trusts, cotton oil and linseed oil trusts, sugar and whiskey trusts, and envelope, salt, cordage, oilcloth, paving pitch, school slate, gas, and meat trusts.
Which acted as virtual monopolies, I take it.
Exactly, and these trusts were very unpopular because they restricted supply and raised costs, all for the benefit of the 19th century's version of the 1%. Eventually, the business world did move on to other legal arrangements, but the word trust remained popularly associated with anti-competitive business practices. So people were getting angry about this, and over the following few decades, there was a big political appetite to do something about the problem. And antitrust is based on 3 laws that grew out of this era, and then subsequent court cases that established precedent within this area of law. First off was the Sherman Antitrust Act of 1890. It targeted railroads and the like, and it prohibited 2 types of behavior. First, anti-competitive agreements, and second, unilateral conduct that monopolizes or attempts to monopolize a market. The act authorized the Department of Justice to bring suit against companies that violate the act, and authorized injured parties to bring suit for 3 times the damages that they had suffered. And since the federal government is constitutionally limited to regulating interstate commerce, antitrust law only applies to commerce that crosses state borders or takes place within the District of Columbia. In theory, then, if you have a big and nasty monopoly that only operates within a single state, the feds would not be able to touch you. Mm-hmm. This, by the way, is how Major League Baseball was able to escape, because when they were brought up on an antitrust suit, the judge in that case ruled that a ball game between the Boston Red Sox and the New York Yankees does not constitute interstate commerce. That's something we briefly touched on back in our baseball episode.
Yeah, and it's a willful fiction, I would say.
Yeah, I think everyone agreed to look the other way.
Right.
The Sherman Act seeks to protect consumers from abuses and maintain competition in the market. As it was put in a later Supreme Court decision, quote, "The purpose of the Sherman Act is not to protect businesses from the working of the market. It is to protect the public from the failure of the market. The law directs itself not against conduct which is competitive, even severely so, but against conduct which unfairly tends to destroy competition itself." That's worth repeating. The Sherman Act protects consumers, not companies.
Right.
If consumers are not demonstrably suffering from a dominant company's conduct, that company's business practices may be ruthless, but they're not illegal. In the years since the laws passed, federal courts have developed a body of law that clarifies and fleshes out the law, making certain types of anti-competitive conduct 100% illegal per se, while other types may be legal or illegal depending on context and whether the judge finds them to be a, quote, unreasonable restraint of trade, unquote.
So this is the beginning of the progressive era, I believe, in American history. So I guess it's not surprising that the Sherman Antitrust Act happened at this point, because this is when the Gilded Age was at its height and American citizens were just starting to realize how they were being ground down and screwed royally by capitalism as it existed at that time.
Right. And you can definitely see that stamp in the law, that it's specifically to protect consumers against ruthless monopolistic businesses. If this had been legislation that was driven by business interests, it would very much have a different slant to it.
Right.
So the Justice Department brought suit against Standard Oil in 1909. They were accused of protecting their monopoly by secret rebate deals and economic threats, raising prices where they enjoyed monopoly, and lowering them in other areas to drive competitors out of the market. And in 1911, the Supreme Court upheld a lower court judgment, and the Standard Oil case resulted in the breakup of Standard Oil into 34 separate companies, many of which have since recombined, particularly into ExxonMobil. John D. Rockefeller had already retired by this point, since he owned a quarter of the shares of the 34 companies that he owned, and breaking up Standard Oil resulted in the stock price doubling and made him the richest man in the world. The Sherman Act hadn't done as well against monopolies as people had hoped, though, and Woodrow Wilson campaigned for president on the promise to do something about it. So after he was elected, he followed through with 2 pieces of legislation. First, there was the Federal Trade Commission Act of 1914, which bans unfair methods of competition and unfair or deceptive acts or practices. It established the FTC, an important regulatory board, to enforce these provisions by issuing cease and desist letters and arguing cases in federal court. And then shortly after that came the Clayton Act, also in 1914, which granted the FTC the authority to act against monopolistic business practices and specifically exempted labor unions from antitrust law since they had been collateral damage in running afoul of the Sherman Act. The Clayton Act also prohibited 4 types of business conduct, if any of them served to substantially lessen competition or create a monopoly. First, price discrimination between different purchasers. Second, exclusivity deals, or tying one sale to an agreement to buy another product. Third, mergers and acquisitions that would lessen competition. And fourth, any one person being a director of two or more competing organizations if those corporations would violate antitrust criteria by merging.
Right.
So that's the law. So question for you, Joe. Based on what you now know, would you say that monopolies are illegal under U.S. law?
I would say no, because it seems like the onus is on the people who are aggrieved by monopolies to bring actions either in court under antitrust law or politically via the FTC in order to curb monopoly power. That's my guess.
You are correct. Monopolies are not illegal, and there is such a thing as a, quote, innocent monopoly, which you would arrive at by just having a better product than your competitors. And it is entirely legal to do so long as you don't abuse that monopoly position. So, for example, Joe, if you were to open a chain of pizza restaurants based on your grandmother's recipe for pepperoni pizza, and that pizza is so delicious that no one ever wants to eat anyone else's pizza, and all the other pizza companies go out of business and you become the pizza king, there would be nothing illegal about that. Just simply having a better product and acquiring a monopoly by means of selling that product is entirely legal under the law.
Well, that would be a fiendishly brilliant scheme by me, too, to replace all pizza with just pepperoni pizza.
I know, but your competitors would have to prove in a court of law that consumers are harmed by losing access to such things as sausage and mushroom.
Right.
Monopolistic behavior only becomes illegal if the monopoly was gained by nefarious means or an innocent monopolist later acts to artificially maintain the monopoly. So going back to the argument that some people have made that the big four tech companies are too big and it's hard for other companies to compete against them, not illegal. The law protects consumers, not competitors. The fact that other social networks have it tough against Facebook is not, under current law, sufficient reason to break that company up.
So from what you're saying, I'm struck by the central role of the FTC here, and I believe that's staffed by political appointees. And it kind of switches back and forth between Republicans and Democrats with each successive presidential administration. But it seems to me like the FTC should be staffed by sober, impartial experts in this area of law and commerce. Doesn't it seem that way to you, given their central role in regulating this stuff?
Yeah, it does seem that way. The FTC actually has a pretty good reputation for not falling completely under the sway of political appointees. My understanding is that it is composed of 5 members, 2 Republicans, 2 Democrats, and then the commissioner is a 100% political appointee, and so that's where political sway comes into it. In fact, Trump's commissioner of the FTC was a pretty controversial choice because he was considered a very strongly pro-business person in that role.
And if I can just speculate for a second, whoever Biden installs as the commissioner of the FTC would arguably have the deciding vote on proceeding with all these administrative and legal actions that the Trump administration started against Facebook and Google at the end of last year.
Yeah, exactly so. And we will swing back around to political influence on regulatory processes later, but what you point out is an important part of that these people are not coming in just through academia or through some other process which assures us that they're acting simply in the interest of the law. They're politically appointed, right, and so that has an influence on it. So antitrust law was originally formed more than a century ago in response to things like railroads and oil companies and meat packers, but it has been used against tech companies before. For instance, AT&T, the FCC brought suit against AT&T in 1974 because they suspected that AT&T was using monopoly profits from its Western Electric subsidiary to subsidize the cost of its network, which was contrary to U.S. antitrust law. And they eventually, in 1982, arrived at a consent decree by which AT&T was allowed to keep its long-distance operations, Western Electric and Bell Laboratories, in exchange for divesting from its 22 local phone monopolies. But that decision to go against AT&T is still somewhat controversial to this day because Ma Bell had a reputation for providing cheap phone service. And so it's questionable whether or not customers were well served by this action.
Yes, and I can say as a disgruntled Verizon customer that I sure wish we had not broken up AT&T in hindsight.
Right. The government brought suit against IBM in 1969 because of measures it was taking to protect its position within the mainframe and microcomputer market. And over the course of 13 years, IBM tried to fight this case off. And at one point, they had 200 attorneys working on their defense. 950 witnesses were deposed, generating 30 million pages of documentation. And the deflating result in 1982 was that the government just abandoned the effort, partly because a conservative administration had come in, and partly because by that point, IBM's business had already mostly collapsed because of pressure from the personal computer market. And microcomputers and mainframes were just no longer what anyone wanted. And then in Microsoft was sued under antitrust law in 1990. And at the time, Microsoft was the big bad in the tech industry. It was pretty notorious for hard-nosed business tactics. And they signed contracts with computer makers that wanted to pre-install Windows that required certain other Microsoft products to be pre-installed and locked competitors out of those computers entirely. Specifically in this case, though, the government went after Microsoft because of how they were responding to the Internet. That Microsoft was concerned that the Internet could challenge Windows dominance. They were afraid that the web would become a virtual operating system. And so they first created Internet Explorer as a pre-installed browser on all Windows systems, and then they started tying IE closer and closer to Windows, adding browser technologies that only worked into Internet Explorer on Windows machines. And since Microsoft owned something like 95% of the PC market at the time, many Internet destinations started building websites that only worked properly on Internet Explorer,
Right.
which made it very difficult for companies like Netscape to compete. And I am old enough to remember what this was like at the time. That I had a Macintosh at home, and it was a routine experience that I would hit a Internet destination where it would say, our website only works on Internet Explorer. Come back with IE. And of course, at the time, IE did not exist on the Mac. And so I just had no recourse other than to grit my teeth.
Right. And I experienced this from the opposite end as a lifelong PC user, both in the office and at home. Internet Explorer was basically all that you could get. And I became a dedicated Internet Explorer user until quite recently. It's only in the last year or two, really, that I've switched my browser of choice to Google Chrome from IE.
Well, you're living on the cutting edge there, Joe.
Yeah.
Yeah, so Microsoft's argument in court was that customers were benefiting by what they were doing, so it wasn't illegal under antitrust law. But the initial judgment in 2000 was against Microsoft and directed that the company be broken into two units, a Windows company and a software company. That was eventually reversed on appeal. Microsoft managed to get the judge removed from the case because that judge had been giving interviews to the press prior to releasing his decision. And in 2001, the case was settled with Microsoft agreeing to abide by certain restrictions, but most people viewed the settlement as a basic slap on the wrist. And then there was Apple and the iBooks case, which is kind of a counterintuitive application of antitrust law. This was in 2012, by the way. There was at this time an ebook seller who was pricing books below cost in an attempt to claim market share. This was the same sort of thing that got Standard Oil in trouble. That bookseller, however, was Amazon, but the government brought suit against their competitor in this situation, which was Apple. Amazon was pricing ebooks at $9.99, no matter what the publisher was charging them for it. They were willing to take a loss on individual sales, since they made the money back on Kindle sales and customer loyalty. Publishers, though, weren't happy about that, because they were afraid that the perceived value of a best-selling book was going to be eroded by low-cost ebook sales. And Apple signed a deal with publishers that allowed them to price their ebooks in the iBook market at whatever level they wanted. And by the way, Apple at this time held a very, very small share of the ebook market. The publishers, though, once this deal was signed, started to remove their books from the Amazon marketplace, which the government judged to be an illegal attempt to raise prices by withholding supply. They sued Apple and 4 publishing companies. A judge ruled against them in 2013. Apple ended up paying a $450 million fine, but they continued to assert that they had done nothing wrong in the case. The court also appointed an antitrust monitor to keep an eye on Apple, who operated at Apple's expense, and he started rummaging through Apple records, billing the company $50,000 a week and demanding unfettered access to company executives. So, Joe, antitrust monitor. It's good work if you can get it.
Yeah, I hear you. But boy, what an interesting case that is. And I agree it's counterintuitive. Here's Apple trying to restore the price of a book to what the writer and publisher wants it to be, and they get sued for that.
And lose.
So
yeah.
Basically, you can come out and undercut the prices that would have existed in the world before internet platforms, and you can get away with it.
Right.
Basically is what my takeaway.
Yeah. And meanwhile, Amazon was enjoying a monopoly position without any government scrutiny and eventually raised its prices on ebooks, so customers didn't really get anything out of the suit. You could argue, in fact, that in this case, the government's application of antitrust law made the market less competitive, not more. Amazon was a near monopoly then, and it's even more dominant now.
Yeah, right. Does iBooks even exist anymore?
It's still there. It's still there. If you buy an iPad, for instance, there will be an iBooks app on there. I imagine some people use it. I have an iPad. I'm a loyal Apple user. I do not use iBooks. If I need an ebook, I go to Amazon for it.
Okay.
Because I'm just like pretty much everyone else in this country.
Right. Yeah.
So that was 8 years ago, and there hasn't been a notable tech antitrust suit since. And there are a number of factors operating against bringing suits like this. First, politicians and judges often don't seem to understand technology or tech markets. When Facebook was acquiring Instagram, for instance, regulators looked at it as a question of whether the acquisition would harm competition in the camera app marketplace. But Instagram wasn't valuable because it was a popular camera app. It was popular and valuable because it was a fast-growing social network that happened to be built around sharing photos. So regulators in this case completely misunderstood the market that they were attempting to regulate. On a more general level, if one primary purpose of antitrust law is to protect consumers against higher prices, what do you do with products like Facebook or Google or Instagram that are free, at least on the surface? These services actually are not free. You pay for them by way of the advertising that's served up to you.
Right.
But a startup company, for instance, that's ad-free today and paid for by venture capital can easily fly under the antitrust radar when regulators are considering a merger or an acquisition. Second, these cases can take a really long time. 8 years in the case of AT&T, 10 years for Microsoft, 13 in the case of IBM, and 13 years is an eternity in the tech world. The iPhone, for instance, is only 14 years old now, and entire industries have been created since it was unveiled.
And I suspect these new suits are going to be the mother of all antitrust battles and may take 20 years to resolve.
Right. So by the time the suit's been initiated, discovery and trial conducted, and judgment issued, the market will have changed, and that's not even allowing for appeals. Third, and this is the most important thing, companies like Facebook, Google, Amazon, and Apple got as big as they did because people really like them, which makes it very hard to make an antitrust argument against them. As much as people talk about hating Facebook, the fact that they keep using it every day suggests that they also really kind of love what Facebook does for them. Apple's products are generally more expensive than the competition, yet they have user satisfaction rates in the high 90s. We all know that Amazon is driving smaller companies out of business, but we keep shopping there because we like the low prices, the wide selection, and free shipping. And we all know that Google is tracking every move that we make online, but we keep using Google's products because those products provide us with value. There are other search engines, and they're just as free as Google, but most of us don't use them. So if antitrust law is meant to protect consumers, the government is in a hard spot if it tries to use it to break out companies that consumers actually really like.
Yeah, no, your point is well taken, but I still would have this intuition that there's a bit of paternalism involved here with antitrust law. In other words, sometimes people need to be protected against themselves, and there's a greater harm going on when everybody is patronizing one business to the exclusion of all others. So even if they like that one business, their view of that business is kind of in a vacuum created by monopolistic practices, you know? And so maybe the government's role is to say, we're still going to break up that business, even if it's universally approved, because we know better. We know that in a market that has many competing businesses, ultimately customer satisfaction is higher.
Yeah.
That's my intuition.
Yeah, well, I think paternalistic is the right term there because, that's very much the attitude that a parent takes to a child, right? Like, I know that you want to eat candy and watch television, but what you should be doing is doing your homework and cleaning up your room. And while I agree in principle that what the public wants isn't necessarily what the public needs, I think we've seen an excellent example of that lately with viral content around, say, QAnon or other conspiracy theories. Like what people consume online isn't necessarily what they should be consuming. I do think we get into difficult territory if we start imagining that some government agency is going to tell people, no, not that, you should be doing this, because as with the FTC, who appoints that commissioner and what ideological strand are they pulling on?
Right.
So with all of that as background, should big tech be broken up? And so let's take a quick look at the big four and ask, is what they are doing illegal under antitrust law? That is their behavior clearly anti-competitive in a way that harms people like you and me? With Facebook, we could say that acquisition of companies like Instagram was certainly anti-competitive and should never have been approved. In my eyes, that acquisition pretty clearly violates the Clayton Act.
And why was it approved?
Well,
like
I said, some regulators thought that they were looking at whether or not it would harm competition within the camera app market. They were not evaluating it as one social network eating up another social network and becoming an even bigger social network, which is how they should have evaluated it. So they basically misunderstood which market they were regulating.
Okay, so ignorance is the reason for that one.
Right. Google is pretty notorious for favoring its own products in search results pages. And though their search algorithm is so complex that unless there's a smoking gun in someone's emails, it would be difficult to prove deliberate intent in a court of law. Amazon, as we mentioned, was willing to offer ebooks at a loss in order to build market share and undercut its competitors. And they've more recently been accused of mining data from its own marketplace partners to undercut small and medium-sized businesses with knockoff products. And they require partners to use Amazon's fulfillment centers if they want preferential treatment on Amazon.com. That stuff seems illegal, at least to my eyes, based on what I know. In the case of Apple, some have argued that it's anti-competitive for Apple to prevent anyone from installing software on an iPhone except via its own app store. I don't think this one holds water because for the vast majority of iPhone users, it's a good thing that every app has to be approved by Apple, because then they don't need to worry so much about scammers, hackers, and viruses. And they benefit by Apple's enforcement of certain quality standards as well. So I think it's a tough sell to argue that ordinary consumers are being harmed by this basic arrangement in the iPhone. But they could get in trouble for using the App Store to favor iMusic over Spotify, which they do, and for requiring app developers like Netflix, for instance, to use Apple's payment processor, through which they have to give 30% of whatever they charge back to Apple, rather than sending users out to Netflix's own sign-up page on the web. 30% of a $1 purchase, by the way, covers the cost of processing the credit card transaction. And many apps in the App Store do cost about $1, so that percentage isn't completely arbitrary, but this does put the company in a vulnerable position.
Right.
In 2019, on the eve of her presidential run, Elizabeth Warren answered the question with an emphatic yes. Do break up big tech. She called them out for using mergers to limit competition. She called out Amazon for using data from its marketplace to copy retailers' goods and then sell them at a discount. and Google for burying competitors in their search results. She called for legislation to designate any company with global revenue of $25 billion or more and offers an online marketplace a, quote, platform utility, and not be allowed to offer their own goods or services on the platform. This would, for instance, force Amazon Basics to be split from the Amazon Marketplace, and Google would be split into Search, AdWords, and its other businesses. It would also split Apple from the App Store, and platforms would be required to treat users, quote, fairly, unquote, and both businesses and private citizens would be allowed to bring suit if they thought their treatment was unfair. She also proposed reversing any mergers that were in hindsight illegal, such as Amazon's acquisition of Whole Foods and Zappos, Facebook's acquisition of WhatsApp and Instagram, and Google's acquisition of Waze, Nest, and DoubleClick. But the question is, would this work to the public's benefit? Splitting Waze off from Google isn't going to do much. They already have Google Maps, and internet-connected home devices like Nest don't really seem to expand or protect Google's monopoly in search. And then there's Apple, and here Warren said in an interview that the phone business needs to be split from the software business, which would mean that iPhones would seemingly be shipped completely empty with no apps at all, which would put quite a burden on consumers to actually make their iPhones usable, considering that there would need to be an app on the phone just to install other apps. And in the case of third-party apps, Warren argues that Apple shouldn't be able to control what can and can't be installed. Like we said, that's how Apple protects its users against the third-party malware and spyware that's been a real problem for Android users. This proposed measure would protect Apple's competitors, but would likely harm ordinary iPhone users, and that's kind of the opposite of what antitrust law is supposed to do. I do think there's an antitrust case to be made against Apple, but it's not a question of what apps are on the phone. That's simply the wrong target. To my eyes, Warren's proposal sounds like it comes from someone who doesn't really understand technology, and her remedies might even make things worse. As Ben Thompson said on his tech blog, Stratechery, quote, tech is not simply another category like railroads or telecom. The truth is that Amazon is a retailer, Apple a combination of hardware maker and platform maker, Google is a search and advertising company, and Facebook a publishing and advertising company. They all have different value chains and different ways of impacting competition, both fairly and unfairly. And to fail to appreciate just how different they are is a great way to make bad laws that not only fail to fix problems, but also create entirely new ones, unquote.
So it sounds like that kind of thinker, is not necessarily opposed to targeted antitrust enforcement of these companies, but resists the idea of lumping them together as one monolith when they're actually very different businesses.
Yeah, his point is that tech is a means, not an end. And so going after big tech, that's the wrong umbrella term. You should be thinking about these as just individual companies that are enabled by technology, but not defined by them.
Right.
And after doing this reading, it definitely seems to me like antitrust is probably not the way to resolve problems in the tech market overall. It's slow, very, very slow. And by the time a judgment has been delivered, appealed, and finally decided, the entire market will have changed. A suit that's brought during the Biden administration might still be contested through both of President Kamala Harris's 2 terms, only to be dismissed by the Justice Department the next time a pro-business candidate is elected to the White House.
Like Ivanka.
Right. It is, oh God, no. do not jinx us, Joe. It is fundamentally dependent on people like Elizabeth Warren, who are in their 60s, 70s, and 80s to make informed decisions about cutting-edge technology, and I, for one, am not confident that that will happen. And we're not just talking about one big, difficult case the Justice Department would need to pursue and win. It would be 4 cases. It seems impossible that they would have the resources to pursue those cases simultaneously, but in sequence, I mean, that could take 50 years. Some people think that instead of antitrust, government regulation is the way to go. Create a political office whose job is to oversee aspects of the tech market. This does seem to me like it could be a very bad idea. Government regulators are more responsive than the courts, but they are also more politically motivated. Some people might like the idea of a world in which the government decrees what features the next iPhone can and cannot have, or announces which businesses are allowed to compete in which market, but I am not one of those people. And in the last days of the Trump administration, we saw what it looks like when the machinery of government starts going after tech companies for ideological rather than legal reasons. I come closest to accepting this idea if it's very narrowly defined. For instance, government oversight into what platforms like Facebook or YouTube do about hate speech. Ben Thompson, for instance, advocates for a framework in which government regulation is focused on platforms that make money by serving up advertising to their users. So think Facebook, Twitter, Snapchat, YouTube, places like that. These companies are focused on driving engagement above all things. So all of their financial incentives render them incapable of dealing with viral content that's socially damaging. And Thompson argues pretty convincingly that regulation is the only remedy in these situations. But even then, I'm a little worried because I wonder what would happen the next time a candidate like Trump manages to get elected and appoints a regulator with a political axe to grind. So my final answer, should we break up big tech? My personal answer is no. The courts move too slowly. The market will have fundamentally shifted on a shorter time frame. We might imagine, though, that existing laws could be strengthened or sped up, but given how politicized antitrust have become recently, that feels inadvisable to me. Over the last 2 years, Republicans in Congress used hearings about antitrust as a way to implicitly threaten tech companies that had, in their view, censored conservative voices. To my ears, this seemed like they were offering a quid pro quo. If YouTube were to leave InfoWars alone, and if Twitter left QAnon alone, and if Facebook tweaked its algorithm to give a bigger audience to right-wing content, all these antitrust problems would magically go away. Antitrust law should not be used as a political club by Democrats or Republicans. Over the long run, I personally believe that we're all better served with legal processes that move slowly, carefully, and focus on benefits to ordinary consumers. There are, however, standard practices in the tech world, such as purchasing startups so that they don't grow into rivals, that are anti-competitive, and regulators should make that more difficult. One proposed remedy, which makes sense to me, is that when the government examines a potential merger, the burden of proof should be on the dominant company to prove that the merger will not harm competition. Currently, the burden of proof is on the regulators. Facebook may seem unassailable now, but their users are getting older, and the number of active users in the U.S. has actually been shrinking over the last 2 years. Someday soon, we may all be worried about how much influence TikTok has on U.S. elections, but Facebook is not eternal. The government should prevent them from purchasing any other social networks, however. The Instagram and WhatsApp errors should not be repeated. As a general principle, I don't think social networks should be allowed to acquire other social networks. Facebook wouldn't be the menace that it is today if there was a rival social network where you and your friends could simply reconvene. Google seems unassailable now, but they have one single profitable business, search. Despite many, many efforts to develop a second successful business, they have so far failed to do so. Eventually, the market will move on from the spaces that Google is able to dominate. They are, however, sitting on a very, very big pile of money, so the government should be looking very closely at any proposed Google acquisitions to make it more difficult for them to protect their position by purchasing potential rivals. Apple seems unassailable now, but even today, at the peak of its powers, the iPhone has 15% of the mobile phone market. 85% of the mobile world is already doing just fine in a non-Apple world. There will be a day when Apple will be like General Electric, the formerly ubiquitous company whose day is clearly past. The government can and should, however, consider going after Apple's 30% cut of developer revenue in the App Store, or at least the requirement that all iOS apps must use Apple's payment processes. As for Amazon, they actually seem like they might be vulnerable to an antitrust suit. They have a history of ruthless behavior. There doesn't seem to be a business sector that Bezos would not like to destroy. And they have definitely priced goods below cost to achieve market share. So yes, Justice Department, please do break up Amazon, or at least try to get a consent decree out of them.
And they won't let their employees unionize.
Right. In the meantime, we definitely need stronger privacy laws, though in this arena we should be careful. If privacy laws are onerous and require companies to spend lots of money staying in compliance with those laws, that would drive small companies out of the market because they can't maintain the costs of remaining compliant and be sort of a backwards benefit for the big corporations, like the Big Four. You will notice that I've almost entirely circumvented the question of misinformation and hate speech here, even though that is a primary driver of some people's interest in regulating or breaking up big platforms like Facebook and Google.
Yes, I did notice.
That's because it's a really hard problem to solve. Germany, for instance, passed a law in 2017 that made social media companies responsible for removing hate speech and illegal content within 24 hours. Authors of the offensive content can be imprisoned for up to 2 years for insults or generic threats, and up to 3 years for murder or rape threats. And the primary target of this legislation was far-right hate groups, which have been as big a problem in Europe as it is here in the U.S. The Human Rights Watch came out against this law, though, saying the law is, quote, vague, overbroad, and turns private companies into overzealous censors to avoid steep fines, leaving users with no judicial oversight or right to appeal. They argue that the law will serve to suppress lawful speech, as companies will move over quickly to avoid large fines and will err on the side of silencing free expression. Platforms are also required to report hate speech to law enforcement. And by doing so, they would direct the scrutiny of the police at some citizens who aren't doing anything wrong. And that's a very scary prospect for some people, particularly members of marginalized communities. States including Honduras, Venezuela, Vietnam, Russia, Belarus, Kenya, India, Singapore, Malaysia, and the Philippines are all considering similar laws along the model of Germany's legislation. And the fear is that these laws will be used not to protect the public from hate speech, but simply to suppress dissent. So this issue raises very thorny questions about who we will trust to police speech and how we will empower them to go about it. And I already had enough complexity to deal with in antitrust alone, so we'll have to leave that for another podcast. So what do you say, Joe? Should we break up big tech?
You know, I'm more sympathetic to the idea of breaking up big tech than I think you are. And though a lot of your points ring true and make sense, and I'm persuaded by them, I feel like the effect of what you're advocating is to grandfather in the terrible mistakes we've already made of allowing the big four to become as big as they are in the first place, you know? And we will make sure that there isn't another WhatsApp debacle and that, these companies don't buy all their competitors going forward, but we're left with these four behemoths that are, I think, clearly abusing the marketplace right now. So that's my main problem with what you're advocating. And I just feel like it's hard for me to articulate this because I'm not an expert in this field, but I kind of feel like there's a where there's smoke, there's fire kind of aspect to the problems with big tech. And I can point to a couple of examples to make this more understandable. One is, isn't it interesting that Trump's banishment from Facebook and Twitter was arguably much more substantial a punishment for his perceived sins than his 2 impeachments, you know? Much more substantial a punishment, much more significant a punishment. And what does that say about our society, where we can impeach the president twice, and yet it's his removal from Twitter that's actually damaging him more than being impeached? Doesn't that alone argue in favor of Twitter having too much power? You want to react to that? Because I have a few others to throw at you.
Yeah, I do think that losing his megaphone was tremendously important for someone like Trump because that was the basis of his power. That's how he marshaled his support. That's how he punished people who stepped out of line. That was how he whipped up the mob to support him and got other politicians to be afraid of him. But I do think that we sort of historically have a narrow focus on this. There have been enormous megaphones before that have been abused. William Randolph Hearst, for instance, had a huge megaphone by way of the newspapers that he owned and ran, and
Right.
he used those to support very reactionary politics.
And for that matter, Rupert Murdoch is the modern day William Randolph Hearst.
And if I have my history right, Hearst actually managed to get us into a war. The Spanish-American War, if I'm not misremembering history, was fanned up and kicked off because Hearst thought that we should do it. And so Trump is not the first in our history to use a megaphone like this.
Yeah.
And the country survived Hearst. And so I feel like the country can probably survive Trump, but we tend to magnify the problems of today as insurmountable and forget that the same problems have cropped up before and basically time took care of them.
I also agree
that makes
that
sense.
we can survive Trump, but it's very telling to me that the decapitation of his Facebook and Twitter accounts has really rendered him kind of impotent in the real world. And that perhaps means we've conferred too much power on those companies in the first place. But I want to mention a couple other things. So I work for public television, as you know, but our listeners may not. And one of my jobs is to kind of police copyright infringements of our content on YouTube, among other places. And over the course of many years of doing this for my public television station, I've become convinced that YouTube is like an organized crime syndicate which gets away with immense intellectual property crimes each and every day. So, and it's by virtue of these safe harbor provisions in copyright law that allow them to post all this infringed content and not have a duty to proactively curate that content ahead of time to prevent copyright infringement, and then only jump in when the victim of the crime reports the copyright infringement. And that's very troubling to me, even though I will freely admit I use YouTube to access stuff I never used to be able to see on television or radio.
Right.
But just the fact that I participate in this organized crime scheme doesn't mean it is an organized crime, So that's also, I think, an example of how we've given far too much deference to social media companies. This Section 230 of the Communications Decency Act, which there's a big debate over whether it should be repealed, and the safe harbor provision in the Digital Millennium Copyright Act mean that these companies get to make tons of money off of stolen content,
Right.
Some of which will never be removed because the person whose content is being stolen from out under their nose doesn't even know it, and then it puts a huge onus on that victim of crime to rectify the crime instead of having the platform do it for them.
Well, I would say that we could talk about copyright for the next hour. Like we could just keep on going
Right.
just roll this into a double episode. So maybe we circle back on this. What you were talking about, though, brought to mind another thing that came up in my reading that I did not include, which is that particularly measures to protect against copyright infringement in these platforms, and the laws are stronger in Europe or Australia, for instance, than they are here, can have a really perverse effect in that anything that makes for strong penalties for hosting copyrighted content on your platform requires the sort of barriers that are impossible to maintain except if you are an enormous company. Like Google has already spent $100 million to protect against copyright infringement on YouTube, and you are still angry at how poor a job they are doing of it. So consider the situation of a potential rival to YouTube, where they would face the same legal requirement and the same risk of penalty. And where would they possibly find the money and the manpower in order to protect against that? They wouldn't. That would drive them out of the market. And what you have left is the company that's already enormous, YouTube. So laws like that, even if they're well-intended to go against abuses of large monopolistic platforms, can, if they're not very carefully framed, actually protect the monopoly because they make it too expensive to compete unless you're already enormous.
Yeah, that's a fair point. I would only say that I think Google didn't even set up the notice of infringement and removal scheme until they were sued by Viacom and lost that lawsuit. So even though they have ended up spending millions of dollars, it was very begrudgingly spent.
Sure.
But then there's one other thing I want to mention, and that is just kind of the insidious nature of the social media business model. And I guess you went to great pains to point out that it's not all of these companies, but some of them. Certainly Google is guilty of this. There's a writer named Ayad Akhtar who I think I read an interview with him recently where I think he really captured something. So I want to read you his quote. He writes, quote, "The tech industry has figured out how to monetize any expression. It doesn't matter whether that expression is truthful or not truthful, whether it's motivated by social justice or whether it's motivated by something else. Underlying all of this is a system that has found a way to make money off of our attention. There isn't a more pressing issue than the ways that we are being incentivized and the way our pleasure principle is being curated. The way that we are being shepherded into the system of really having our behavior predicted and our actions monetized." I think that captures something about this business model of companies like Google that is insidious and needs to be regulated. And it just, on the plain face of it, from a common sense perspective, there's
Right.
something wrong there. This cannot stand.
Yeah.
And we see the results of that every time we have ads pop up about things that we Googled the day or two before.
Right. It also brings to mind a larger topic, which again, we're generating all sorts of podcast episode possibilities here, is the way that technology moves so much faster than human evolution that we are, I think, repeatedly running into situations where new things pop up and become enormously influential within our society before we have a chance to adjust to them.
Yes.
And I think virality is one of those things where somehow it's clicking into our lizard brains and activating mental structures that might have been originally evolved to keep us alive on the Serengeti. And it's a dopamine drip that very few of us are in a position to resist.
Yes.
And as biological creatures, we can't really handle social media. But as biological creatures, we constantly want what social media offers to us.
Yes.
And that is a big social issue. It's potentially a legal issue. There are companies that are absolutely going to try to be your dopamine supplier. And we need, I think, to give some thought to remedies for that situation because the market is not going to provide it for us.
Yes. There's a wonderful documentary called The Social Dilemma that came out last year that does a particularly brilliant job of portraying what you were just talking about. They actually cast an actor who appears in triplicate, who is like the personification of the Google Facebook algorithm at some master control board, like articulating all the various calculations that the algorithm is making to get your attention put back on your phone or on Facebook at that very moment. It's hilarious, but it's also kind of chilling to watch this. So I recommend The Social Dilemma to anyone who's interested in that subject.
Okay, I'll have to check it out. Are you ready for the question for next week?
Yeah, I sure am.
Okay.
Fire away.
So my question is about dementia. And this is something that is very personal for me because both my mother and my father are suffering from it. Over the last few years, I've seen it just swallow my mother whole. So it's been a very emotional topic. And so the first question is dementia a new thing? Like just this year, I've seen that there are 3 movies about people who are struggling with dementia and the people who love them. So is dementia a new thing, or is it just the new word that we're applying to Alzheimer's or to senility? Then beyond that, it engages a topic that I find intriguing, which is, what is memory? When dementia erodes memory, what is being eroded? Like on a physical, on a philosophical, on a psychological level, what are these memories that we lose? So that's my question for you.
Wow, that's fascinating, Mark. I will get on that. Yeah, this is a very important topic that I'm sure is near and dear to a lot of people who would listen to this podcast. So, yes.
Okay, I look forward to it.
All right. If you like this episode of Mansplaining or want to leave a comment about this or any other episode of the podcast, please go to our Facebook page, which is conveniently titled Mansplaining the Podcast. We welcome your feedback, we really do, including topic ideas for future episodes. We love to get feedback, so please let us know what you think. And on that note, that's all for this edition of Mansplaining. That was Mark, I'm Joe, and we'll talk to you next time.
Bye, everybody. That's it for this edition of Mansplaining. Mansplaining is brought to you by Joe and Mark and nobody else. Thank you for hanging out with us for a little bit, and we'll see you next time.